is annoying. I can move it.
Okay.
Yeah. I should be fine. Honestly, I've gotten used to like judging through back and forth.
Can you copy the link? Live's button. The live started. Can you copy the link?
Can I just get
I'll send it over.
confirmation that everyone's okay to be recorded for
Yeah.
various purposes?
Yeah.
Not sure what Rob's going to do with this.
It'll go on the.
Oh, that just say it's on the
Watch it
yeah.
every night.
28.
Yes. Again, anyone not consenting to being live streamed / recorded? I'll start the recording after introduction.
Alright, welcome everyone to this quarterfinal. Congrats on making it to the quarterfinal. You should know most of the housekeeping right now, so remember to find yourself lots of stuff. We'll do a program round, then we'll get to the debate started. Remind you to take a serious explanation or prep time. And if you make a mistake, apologize and move on. I'm your chair. I'm Tom here, please. I have a set of panelists. Let's go away from me. Keep it simple.
Hi, with Salom, she, her, all the best.
Lily, she, they pronouns. Shara, they.
Charlie, for reference.
Awesome, thank you. Affirmative team.
Noah first, they them. Cormac second to reply to you.
And I go
Awesome. Negative team.
Bella first to reply, she, her.
Eugene second, heal day, please.
Charlie third.
Awesome. Thanks everyone. Without further ado then, I'd like to welcome first to start the debate. Here.
Sorry, I shouldn't have sat in the middle. Silly choice. Let's be very clear about what each side has to support in this debate before I make two simple arguments to you. Alright, this debate is a support debate, and we're supporting a global ban, which means we can probably reasonably assume that countries around the world are going to be invested in this ban and they're going to try and ban this. What does this look like? It probably means banning the kinds of apps that you use to trade and use cryptocurrency. It probably means taking down these sites in which cryptocurrency markets operate, and finally investigating into like where cryptocurrency is located, who owns it, and by tax organizations and things like that. I think there are a couple reasons why this is like probably pretty easy to do and actually quite effective. The first is that obviously it's like actually not that hard to monitor the internet. Governments do it all the time. Governments even monitor the deep web and things like that. And I think the thing about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency is that it has a massive digital and physical footprint in the real world with the amount of servers that it uses, meaning that if we go out of our way to ban it and crack down on it, it is actually easy to find where the Bitcoin is. It's just not difficult to find who owns it, but we're just trying to eradicate where it is. But even if it is not that hard to track, I think the important thing is it becomes much less easy to use, which leads to a lot of our benefits. Secondly, if they're going to prop some kind of regulation under their side of the house, why is that regulation incredibly difficult to use? I think a couple of reasons here. Firstly, they have to prove that so our first piece of context is that 85% of Bitcoin, for instance, is owned in 0.5% of Bitcoin addresses, which means it's incredibly centralized and localized, which means it's very difficult to go and regulate those few individuals who actually own most of this shit. I think the second thing is that obviously if countries aren't cooperating together and don't want to regulate in the same way, and countries have a massive incentive not to do so, like Russia and Belarus, because it makes up a big part of their economy, it means that you just go and store your Bitcoin over there, you just have a server over there which isn't regulated or something like that, and yeah, so I think that means it's still quite easy to access. 2 points in this speech. The first about the negative externalities of Bitcoin, and the second about de-dollarization. On the first about negative externalities, and I think don't be misled by the point label here. These are devastating debate-winning harms. The first is about the fact that Bitcoin is anonymous and untraceable, and that leads to a massive amount of crime. It's anonymous and untraceable for the reason that it was invented to avoid government regulation. It is entirely, untraceable. You have no idea who owns it, and things like that. Why does that lead to a massive amount of criminal activity? Obviously, because criminals do not want to be traced by the government. And the difference between that and a regular currency is that a regular currency goes through a bank, and you can subpoena a bank and say, who owns this account? Who was that account started by? Where did the money go? All of these kind of things. You can find out information to make chains of financial causation. But you cannot subpoena the blockchain, right? So you have no idea where any of that money goes. What does that money finance? It finances some of the most horrible criminal gangs in the world. It finances child pornography, terrorism. It finances massive drug cartels. It finances violent state actors like Russia and North Korea because they have so many sanctions on them that they use Bitcoin to also trade between other countries and finance terrorism around the world. And I think the way you should weigh this is absolutely massively, because there is a reason why, for instance, there is such a visceral response in us for things like child pornography and human trafficking. It is because they are some of the most egregious moral crimes that can ever exist in our world. And they are crimes that cannot be weighed up against the economies of different states and things like that. They are so abhorrent that if you vote neg in this debate, you are supporting the continuation of those crimes. Secondly, on tax. Okay, obviously, for the same reason that it is very difficult to track, I think that it's very difficult to regulate tax in terms of capital flight and in terms of understanding how many assets people have. That is because there's no physical assets for you to evaluate. There is no chain of, there's no chain of transactions and stuff like that you use to determine income tax and things like that. That leads to very bad outcomes, not only for developed nations, but for developing nations as well. In developed nations, it means that people use this to change tax bracket and manipulate what tax bracket they're in. They use it to avoid wealth taxes if you are in a nation which has a wealth tax, because you can choose how much wealth is visible to the government, meaning that you just go below the cap where you would be taxed at like 50% of your wealth or something like that. And I think the important thing about this is there is much less will to get regulation around taxation and strong tax, because it's much less visible to governments exactly how bad the income inequality is in these countries, because it's not visible to them. In developing nations, all those same mechanisms apply, but it is much worse because they do not have other alternative forms of tax streams oftentimes, which means that it becomes very difficult to do things like investigate these people, to legislate against it, but also to negotiate with other countries. And if you see, for instance, a tax haven elsewhere in the world, every country can lobby that country and say, no, we should really increase our taxes here, or can you legislate against this for us? The impact of that then, for both developing and developed nations, is that essential government services do not get provided in the way they should, because governments have nowhere near the amount of money that they should. That means children do not go to school. People do not access medical care that they should have been able to access. Those are, again, massive harms. Finally, on the environment, the thing to observe about this is that there is a massive electricity use because of Bitcoin around the world. It is the same, like Bitcoin every year uses the same amount of energy as Malaysia, and I think that is intense. But the more intense thing is it gets exponentially more energy, energy demanding, for the reason that as you go to try and find higher prime numbers to find new Bitcoin, it requires more and more computing power. And the impact of that then, or the harms of it, are twofold. The first is that obviously if there is a global movement to try and stop climate change, perhaps having such a climate intensive strategy, or an energy intensive strategy of currency is something that is deeply inefficient and just very bad for climate change. But the other thing is that it's a massive drain on particular countries' energy grids, particularly developing nations who have a big incentive to try and mine Bitcoin because it is of comparatively more value to their own currency. That kind of thing leads to massive blackouts in Iran that happened a couple of years ago. And that means that people lose air conditioning in heat waves and they die of heat stroke. That means that hospitals cannot run the kind of equipment that they should be running because your entire city has been blacked out. Essential government services, again, do not run. So, those are the three negative externalities which will win us this debate. Observe how graphic the harms are under those. Okay, secondly, on de-dollarization. I think the thing to observe here in context is that there is a trend of global reserve currency becoming Bitcoin because countries want to move independent of the US economy. Okay, what is the harm of this? The US currency is comparatively much more stable than Bitcoin, which I think is probably quite a good thing for most economies. Why is that true? Firstly, because the US has a service-based economy, right? Which means it does not fluctuate with export demands and things like that and export prices. Largely, the US economy is quite stable. And when it is not stable, it's not stable in a place because it's interconnected to so many other economies where the entire global economy is in crisis. And that is exactly symmetrical. If there was a global economic crisis, Bitcoin would indeed be in crisis as well. Comparatively, Bitcoin is not tied to any one economy, which means it is incredibly volatile to supply and demand, which means that, especially considering the piece of setup I gave you about how 85% of this is owned by 0.5% of people, if those people decide that it is a good idea to bet on this, there is a massive shift in how much Bitcoin is worth. And the second reason is that, obviously it is just more speculative because a lot of people just use Bitcoin to gamble, basically, and try and make money. What is the harm of having this in your economy? I think overall, it means states have a less stable currency, which leads to much worse crisis response for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because your bond value fluctuates dramatically, and that fluctuates dramatically because and that fluctuation leads to people either pulling investment out during crisis because they no longer want to have money in your country and they perceive your economy as very volatile, or they never invest in the first place, which is probably extremely harmful for developing economies. The second reason is that if your reserve currency fluctuates, you can't do particular monetary policies like quantitative easing and stuff like that, because if your reserve bank buys things like assets, it's incredibly unpopular and risky because you know how much that's going to fluctuate. That means that it's incredibly difficult to regulate your economy in times of crisis and in general, incredibly proud to propose.
I'd like to thank First Affirmative for that speech. Welcome First Name to start our team's guest. Here.
One of the Zoom is down. Oh, wait. Okay. Zoom stream's on. Yeah, the stream's fine. This affirmative team cuts off the hand that feeds the actors that they claim to care about the most. The developing world has no other access to any forms of stable currency, as Noah concedes in their speech. It is abundantly clear that the only way for these types of people living in the rural depths of sub-Saharan Africa, to get access to a currency that is stable, access to something that's able to allow them to send remittances to their families living in neighbouring states, is just so clearly cryptocurrency. 4 things in the speech. Firstly, 3 pieces of setup. Secondly, knocking out all 3 claims that we just heard. Next, I think it's a framing about how this technology is just so helpful to the people that need it the most. And finally, on how we can deregulate the financial market better. Firstly, 3 pieces of setup. 1, first thing we know about cryptocurrency, there's no ownership, which automatically means that it's decentralized. It's literally based on supply and demand and people mining it. Second of all, extremely easy to get access to. Note the fact that it's things like apps. You just have a profile, you verify your identification, and you're able to access it. But thirdly, note the fact that it's a really good store of value by virtue of the fact that 1, there are some coins that are obviously unstable, but there are others that are far more stable. We point to the difference between Dogecoin and Bitcoin, for example. But also there are no governing bodies that override it, which means there's no incentives to arbitrarily decrease the value of it, for example. Next, let's knock out all 3 substantive contributions from that speaker. 1, on crime. Firstly, crime creates cryptocurrency, quite clearly. But second of all, these people are the most empowered to get around bans if they did exist. They can't just fiat out people not using that, getting around bans. Obviously, these actors, like people who own Pornhub, are the ones that would be most able to get around this regulation. Secondly, on tax. 1, obviously you can still investigate people for tax fraud. 2, people just do other things to evade tax, like put their money in offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, like tie them up in huge amounts of property. But 3, empirically this is not the case. There are very few people that have tried to tax evade by doing cryptocurrency, and incredibly unclear why this would be the most efficient way to tax evade. Thirdly, on the environment. 1, it is so well known that crypto is bad for the environment. There are massive incentives at the moment to decrease the environmental impact that crypto has, to having things like proof of stake, having things like more renewable forms of energy. But second of all, even if the environmental impact is bad, we can just so clearly outweigh it, because that team claims to care about the developing world. The developing world cares more about having money in their hands than they do about the environment. Firstly, first piece is substantive about how we just give people access to currency. 3 things here. 1, on repressive states. 2, on unstable states. 3, on underdeveloped states. Firstly, on repressive states. Here, we're talking about places like Hong Kong, places like Central Asia, places like Cambodia. And the problem in these states is that the ways of sending money are just observed by the state, which means that there's no level anonymity because the banks are all nationalized, which means that it's impossible to opt out of them. So if you live in China, the only way to send money is through the CCP-controlled banks. There's literally no competition to them, which means you have to opt in. That means that they're able to do things like see when people are sending undesirable transactions. They're able to crack down on protests when they see that people are sending money. Note that empirically, during the age of the Hong Kong protests only a couple of years ago, the way that people were able to send money to those protesters was through cryptocurrency, because it's the only way of anonymized and non-centralized transferring of funds. And that is actually what allowed those protesters to get up the ground. It's what allowed them to have capital to actually meaningfully fulfill what they wanted to do. How do we help them with cryptocurrency? 3 ways. 1, it's incredibly tricky, as this affirmative team concedes, to track cryptocurrency. That is literally like one of its defining pillars. Second of all, it's universally accessible, which gives these people at least some access to markets that also exist in the West. But thirdly, it's anonymous. Note the fact that you have a crypto identification number in the same way you have an internet IP address. That thing is incredibly anonymous and difficult for people to figure out. What are the impacts of this? Twofold. 1, it means that you can send money to investigative journalists that are doing incredibly useful work. Note the fact that these people need funds, and the funds that you can send them via cryptocurrency in your own country or externally are small but significant. And second of all, it allows people to send remittances. Note the fact that, for example, if you're working as an illegal immigrant in Kazakhstan and you want to send money home, it is just impossible to do that without the thing that cryptocurrency gives you to do. The flexibility that that provides you is massively. But second of all, it means that people can fund political dissidents and help those people, and that is obviously useful. Secondly, on unstable countries. Note here we're talking about places like Argentina and Chile and Turkey. And the problem with these places is they've done horrific financial policy, they've had massive excesses of spending, which means that they've had inflationary spirals, and it means they're in just huge, huge levels of debt and are trying to be bailed out at the moment. And what that means is that people now are scared of putting their money in the banks because all the faith that once existed in these stores of value has been decimated because these banks have actively prevented people from exchanging their currencies and switching them. They've prevented people from saving. They've arbitrarily devalued the currency because they were so desperate to get it back. They have just caused huge foreign exchange crises. And all of that means that these people are just scared to put their money in their bank account. That means that we are able to give them that option for 4 reasons. One, the fluctuations of cryptocurrency obviously exist, that is a true fact, but they aren't localized, which means that in the way that there are localized fluctuations in these places like Argentina, if crypto goes down, everyone goes down. Obviously that was true of the crypto bubble a few years ago. But second of all, and an important piece of mitigation for that speaker, is that some currencies are just more stable than others. So we note that a few currencies are pegged to the US dollar, e.g. the USDC, and things like Bitcoin and Ethereum have remained relatively high in value despite falling. But thirdly, it means that you can always access it. So even if you lose value, you can at least access it, which a lot of these banks don't even allow you to do in the first place. But finally, you can always transfer your coins from a less stable to a more stable coin, and that is a benefit. Thirdly, on underdeveloped countries, we're talking here mainly about sub-Saharan Africa. People have limited access to no access to a banking system, who, for example, they're banks that just don't reach really rural and regional areas, noting the fact that being able to access crypto just alleviate a huge amount of people's suffering. Why do we think they can't access their national banks or online banks? Firstly, they require a proof of citizenship, which a lot of people just don't have. So for example, if you're living and working in Ethiopia, but your citizenship is in Oman or another neighbouring country, it's just very difficult to send money to that place. Thirdly, banks require ID, a lot of it, like a thing that it's actually quite difficult to access. But thirdly, we note that the banks see these people as too high risky to actually give them profiles because the operating costs are often just not worth it. Why do we think crypto is a more accessible form for these people? 3 reasons. One, we think that it is just easy to get things like internet. We know that Starlink, for example, whilst it has like a high cost up front, it actually is very easy at giving people in a community access to Wi-Fi. Second of all, we know that ratifying your ID on cryptocurrency apps is just quite easy. But thirdly, there's a huge diversity of apps you can pick and choose for the ones that best suit you. What is the impact of this point? Because, panel, don't outweigh the extent to which I've just brought you benefits. We protect people who have been failed by their state, they've been failed by financial institutions that prop to help them. We literally decimate their lives if we allow them no other access to capital. Because it's not national banks or something else, it's national banks or crypto. Those are the only 2 options. Maybe crypto is bad in some regards, and maybe people lose money from it. I literally lost thousands of dollars from it XD. But that does not mean that it is bad. It's still a good thing because at least it gives you some access, and that framing is just essential in this debate. Second of all, why do we provide vital financial competition to key players? Firstly, we make traditional banks better for a few reasons. One, under the status quo, they rest on their laurels massively, which means that they don't innovate because they've already captured the market. Second of all, they've never seen any meaningful competition. But thirdly, the barrier to create a new bank is incredibly high because of the regulations, because of the amount of reserve money you need, because of the brand loyalty. How does crypto do this? One, empirically, crypto has just provided meaningful competition to these banks. It exploded in 2017. Second of all, a mass amount of people use cryptocurrency, not particularly young people who now, instead of putting all of their money in a savings account, put it in crypto so that it has some ability to grow over time because they're not particularly risk averse. But also, people now, instead of investing in ComSec, for example, or instead of buying shares in the S&P, they instead buy crypto coins, right? So the difference here is that banks are scared because the money that traditionally would go to them via stocks no longer goes to them because instead people put money in cryptocurrency. Why is this good? 3 reasons. One, it pressures these banks to increase their levels of accessibility to compete with crypto for young people. Second of all, it means that they're more likely to increase their ease of access, particularly through things like online financing. How do we win this debate? Giving money to people in the developing world who are stuck with shit financial systems is just a huge benefit. Allowing these financial institutions to have some form of competition rocks, obviously both side negative.
I'd like to thank the person who gave that speech. Welcome the second phone to respond. Yeah.
For people that have no access to a bank under this negative teams world, that have no proof of their citizenship in the first place and do not have any way to store their money in a bank, it is incredibly unclear to me how those people then convert their income in those countries into cryptocurrency in the first place. Because you cannot just ask for cryptocurrency and magically receive it. You have to have some way to purchase it in the first place. This team does not have any way for those people to do that. That issue falls out of the debate. Three things then in this speech. Firstly on the environment, secondly on crime, lastly on developing nations with unstable economies. Let's look at the environment here. We get very little response from this negative team. They say, well, we can regulate it through things like renewable energy. But the claim is very obvious. Developing nations, which is the place where Bitcoin, as they acknowledge, is most likely to be generated because of the fact that you can generate more of it, it's worth more in terms of like what your currency is worth. Those are the places that get harmed most by these environmental regulations, right? Those are the places that need their electricity, and when their electricity is drained, it leads to blackouts. For example, like happened in Iran when people were mining too much cryptocurrency. The problem is this team never proved that they are likely to get those regulations in the first place, because when crypto keeps increasing in the amount of money that you, the amount of power that you have to drain into it, you're more likely to have increased harms over time. The other reasons why you should weigh this incredibly highly. Firstly, it affects the developing world. So insofar as they want to talk about developing world with unstable economies, the thing that will fuck those economies the most in the long term is when you have higher rates of climate change, when you have more flooding in those countries, when you have more susceptibility to natural disasters, they get fucked over far greater in the long term. But the second thing to note is there are other ways for developing nations to diversify their economies. For example, if you think that your currency inflation is so fucked, you can invest in things like gold that are relatively stable against inflation. You can, for example, invest in more currencies that are stable, like the US dollar, like your reserve currency, which are alternatives. So, secondly, in terms of crime, the key question here is anonymity good or bad? Because essentially they concede that this makes it very, very easy for criminal organizations to operate because it is untraceable and because it is very difficult to track those things. But the way they respond to this is, well, the worst cases will still exist under our side, never explaining how that is the case. The mechanism we give you from First Affirmative is very, very clear. The reason why institutions or websites like the Pirate Bay can operate currently is because not every country bans it, which means you can host your server in one country and therefore everyone else can access that. The key thing that we bring you is when there is a global ban, you cannot host those servers anywhere. And when Bitcoin needs a huge amount of infrastructure, physical infrastructure, things like servers, in order to store that value, you cannot host that in any individual country, which means it's far, far more difficult for those people, for those services to even operate in the first place. And that also means that even if you believe their claim that like Bitcoin, people will still be able to access Bitcoin under our side, that means that mitigates their own benefits because the people who really, really need it for the type of political advocacy that they talk about can also activate it onto their side. So it's largely symmetricized by that reason. But let's ask the question then, is anonymity good or bad overall, noting that in our case of the world, you have more people using this for crime and perhaps more people using it for political reasons like they talk about. The first thing to note here is that the number of reasons to be anonymous for bad, like the number of ways you can be anonymous for bad reasons is more numerous than the number of ways you can be anonymous for good reasons. For example, there are huge amounts of crimes that societies regulate. There are huge amounts of negative externalities, for example, things like terrorism, for example, things like organized crime that operate specifically through Bitcoin and have no other avenues of operating because you can track their currency. The comparative is, if your cause is so good, there are other ways for you to get around it. You can, for example, have friends or family in other nations. You can, for example, have global assistance. You can, for example, buy another currency that is not going to subpoena you because they do not agree with your authoritarian government. You can operate in a bank that operates in another country, which means that your home country cannot subpoena you. Those are ways to get around that. It's far more difficult for the evil institutions to get around that because most countries are going to collaborate against things like terrorism, against things like organized crime and human trafficking. The second thing to note here in terms of this rank is the scale of the harm versus the scale of the benefit. Because their benefit at best is people get to send a bit more money to political advocacy institutions. Our benefit is we decrease the amount of people that are human trafficked every year because they cannot pay the people that they are human trafficking to. You decrease the amount of child pornography that is available on the internet. Those are incredibly important harms that you should weigh incredibly largely in this debate. And thirdly is a principle analysis. I think insofar as there are harms and benefits in this debate, you should principally act to minimize the worst harms that occur. You should act to minimize the amount of evil that exists in the world rather than trying to maximize the additional slight small benefits to a number of people. And that is incredibly important in terms of weighing those things. Let's then move on to developing nations. The first thing I want to note here is if you believe their push to developing nations are likely to invest in this to de-dollarize, this is likely to be done incredibly badly for a few reasons. Firstly, there's incredibly immediate and immediate political pressure to do this because of current things like inflation, which means that politicians are likely to jump into these decisions incredibly quickly and not give it a lot of thought. Secondly, there are incentives against doing things like raising interest rates, because the most politically powerful people in countries tend to be the ones that own properties, tend to be the ones that benefit the most from having interest rates low and being able to take out more loans and accrue more capital, which means you have incentives under their side to not do things like implement proper monetary policy, like raising interest rates against inflation, but rather do risky things that fuck over the worst people in your economy when it fails. And let's note, it does fuck over the worst people, because when your currency rate fluctuates far more, because you're hedging on an unstable reserve currency that fluctuates only with supply and demand and does not fluctuate as much as the US dollar, the people that are harmed are the people that lose their entire life savings because that value decreases. The people that are harmed are the people who suddenly wake up one day and find that they cannot afford a loaf of bread, or they cannot afford to pay their mortgage because of the fact that those rates and the value of your currency has fluctuated so heavily. And it also decreases the amount of business investment in your economy, because when you hedge your reserve currency on something that fluctuates incredibly rapidly, other businesses are not going to want to invest. Multinational corporations are not going to want to invest in your country, because they know if they take out loans or they write contracts in your currency, they're far more likely to get fucked over in the long term. That increases the supply costs on their end. The last thing to note here is that governments are not incredibly financially savvy. They make mistakes financially all the time. Those mistakes get worse under their side when there's immediate political pressure to act in this way. What do they claim then? They claim, well, you hedge against unstable currencies. But there are other ways to hedge against that. For example, you buy more of your own reserve currency. I would posit that even in most instances, the currencies of these developing nations are more stable than Bitcoin. Because even if you think that they have high rates of inflation, they are still pegged against something underlying, which is your economy, the industries that operate in your economy, and the people that work in your economy, comparative to Bitcoin, which fluctuates only based on supply and demand, which means it is far more likely to be susceptible to things like short selling, susceptible to things like people buying huge amounts of huge amounts of Bitcoin, susceptible to things like, for example, Elon Musk posting on Twitter about Dogecoin and the market price increasing very, very rapidly and then dropping off suddenly after that. Those are pressures that do not exist when you peg your currency against something underlying. So, secondly, this fucks over your currency even more, right? Because when you are putting more of your currency into Bitcoin, people take their money out of banks and put it into Bitcoin, as they explain on their side. That means banks have less money to loan out to people, less money that is recirculated back into the economy. And this is incredibly important most for developing nations, because the less money that you have in your economy circulating in terms of things like development projects means less infrastructure gets built in the first place, which means that the people do not have access to key resources that they need. When you take money out of the economy, that is the harm. So the second thing is it leads to capital flight in the first place, because it's a circular argument, right? Because when you have more people taking their money out of the banks and putting it into Bitcoin, it also increases the risk in your economy. It also increases the perception that your economy is failing, which means more people take their money out in the future. You are less likely to get foreign investment under their side of the house, which fucks over developing nations, not only in the short term and increases economic crisis, as for example happened in Venezuela when they tried to do the thing that the negative team suggests, but also makes it far, far worse in the long term because people invest less money into your banks. Last thing in terms of tax, well, they say, well, they can go to other places. As we explained, it's far, far more easy to regulate on our side. So proud to close.
I'd like to thank Second Affirmative for that speech, welcome Second Negative.
God, this opposition is so doom and gloom. Like, they're extrapolating their impacts to the absolute moon because they just need to compensate for the fact that they're choosing pretty challenging arguments to prove in the first place. And even if they do prove them, actually just seem ultimately pretty marginal in this debate. I want to start by rebuilding our case because I think we immediately win by explaining that there is a series of very vulnerable actors that we simply help escape poverty. And this has three different components. The first is a series of repressive states. And side opposition's sole response to this is the people in Hong Kong can just piggyback of the North Korean cryptocurrency system or something else like that. But I think just missed a lot of the nuance of that type of analysis. We explained that, for instance, places like organized crime networks, which access forms of underground cryptocurrency networks that gained access to through explicit sets of connections, are the types of individuals that can still access things like crypto exchanges, but it is the everyday to-day citizen, the person in Hong Kong that really needed that highly accessible app that they themselves have modeled out to be exclusive in this debate, that is the person that is denied access. I think this argument still stands. But the second argument we give is on inflationary and highly untrustworthy countries and untrustworthy banks. The first argument they give is an incredibly lazy response, just being like, these countries have incentives to kind of be good and not inflationary. Like, yeah, I guess that's true, but you can tell that to the Turkish citizens who are experiencing serious inflation on the ground because it's not universal, it's not uniform. There are actors that implement a series of central bank governors that are lowering inflation interest rates in a time of incredibly high inflation. And their other lazy response is just like, they'll just use USD and gold instead, which firstly undermines a large majority of their harms in this debate. But yeah, that's cool and all, but how do you think you get remittances back from your partner in an overseas country? They're like sending gold to you through a carrier pigeon? There's a reason why they're using cryptocurrency, right? It's because it's digital, and that's how they make transactions. If you have a business and you're seeking investment, if you're a media company in Hong Kong and urgently are trying to get funds, you need these type of external actors that can give you these transactions through this form of digital currency. But last, they say it's really inaccessible, like if you don't have an ID and haven't access to bank, how on earth could you access crypto? Like, what? Like, how do you think they have USD under your side? It's called an exchange broker. What they do is take a cut off the top and then give you access to crypto in exchange for your cash. But secondly, this misses the point of the argument on top of that, because we explicitly explain cryptocurrency has unique incentives to be able to break into a series of markets, a series of highly disprivileged people that historically have not had access to financial services. That is simply because that is their target market. This is the type of person in a very rural community where a bank is not making significant profit off the transactions that that individual will make and has very low incentives to provide that service. But cryptocurrency explicitly reaches out to those people with a highly accessible app with very low forms of identification, with very low risk, which is why those people can access cryptocurrency under our side, but not banks under side opposition. I immediately think we win the debate off this analysis. Because states have a direct obligation not to hurt the citizens they have hurt so significantly in the past. When we say that there are innocent citizens, ordinary people in Argentina, who had their savings wiped by the fact that the government immediately just claimed their savings in those bank accounts, that is fundamentally different to the type of punishment that side opposition describes. Because yes, there are some people that might be victims of scams on cryptocurrency, or might have to pay for slightly higher electricity costs, but they have not been betrayed by the state in the same way. They have not lost this trust in the state and the financial institutions of that state in the same way. And as such, we think that directly these type of states and the international community more broadly should not hurt those individuals a second time. What are their long shot bows of like 4 different very high impact speculative arguments in response to this? The first, and I think the most reasonable, is about volatility, and the way they impact this is much more on scams. But I think it has 2 broad problems. The first is that the type of person, if you are in Argentina, you're not investing in a highly speculative thing like Dogecoin, right? These people aren't stupid. They're investing in the stable coins like USDC, which is directly pegged to the US dollar, which is the most stable cryptocurrency by far. And the reason they're doing that is twofold. Firstly, because it is the explicit type of transaction that is the cheapest by far for them. Yeah? Like these stable coins are a smart contract on the Ethereum network, and as such have lower transaction costs, which directly caters towards this type of individuals. But it is secondly, because it's not the type of actor that they describe. They're choosing these coins for their stability, so they are the most sensitive to find the best possible coin that protects their asset. But secondly, I want to immediately note that I just don't think the type of gambler or the person that is like falling for pump and dump schemes under side opposition is very sympathetic under this debate at all. Yes, there are some people that are pretty speculative and invest in cryptocurrency, but I don't know, they'll like gamble on Roblox collectibles or some other random thing instead, right? What we care for more about is a series of individuals that are uniquely using cryptocurrency because it is their best possible option. At the end of this, I can see that cryptocurrency is a little bit volatile, but it's not the harm at the end of the day, because people are explicitly choosing it because they have great faith in in that than their own country's governing system. The second big harm is on the environment, and unfortunately 3 years here actually makes a very big difference, because the amount of energy that Bitcoin is currently using is a fraction of the energy that Malaysia uses in the current day. And that is because a huge swathe of people have stopped using Bitcoin as a form of transaction and have instead turned to Ethereum. Why? That is because Ethereum uses a different system of validation, which is proof of stake, where rather than the big prime numbers and enormous amount of computational power that side opposition describes, Ethereum uses a system where big actors that want to mine cryptocurrency have to put collateral. They have to have a stake. And that is why we think that you just don't get this enormous amount of computational power necessary that side opposition describes. Because it's using so much less energy, that is what makes the transactions cheaper and why people are turning away from using Bitcoin for transactions. So at the end of this, I think the energy harm that side opposition describes is true to a small extent, but over time it is getting much lower and it is much overblown. Like, they're just literally trying to be like, people are going to die on heat stroke or in hospitals. Like, what? Like, these countries have rolling blackouts in controlled ways such that critical government services aren't the first ones to go out, that these institutions have emergency generators such that I don't think it is this high stakes harm. It is, yes, your electricity price is a tiny bit higher. I don't think this is that significant. The next argument is on crime, and I think this is just a weak argument because it's unclear why criminal networks wouldn't adapt in pretty significant ways. They existed significantly before crypto using direct wire transfers. Unclear why they can't just have a huge briefcase full of cash. What is the significant difference? I don't understand why they can't make transactions very similar ways, but it's secondly because they do money laundering through the types of mechanisms side opposition describes. Extensive shell companies, investing and money laundering through casinos, buying up a gold mine and using that gold which is now clean. So I just don't think that crime marginally changes a great deal. And yes, they impact it very hard, and it is so bad, but how much do you significantly impair these places by forcing them to not use cryptocurrency? Deeply unclear to me. Their last shot here is on taxation, which I think is the serious argument. That is firstly, because every single company obviously can't just be like, all my consumers pay in cryptocurrency please, right? So they still need to register a bank account and all their transactions are still taxed by corporate tax under our side. But second, who are you really taxing on side opposition? The individuals that are forced to use cryptocurrency, the literal elderly person that is seeking remittances from their son who is working in a neighboring country. These are the types of people that are really suffering and really vulnerable. They're not the types of individuals that should be taxed. But the last shot that side opposition gives is the traditional finance system will have less money circulating. And this has two problems. Firstly, he actually argued this argument as a deterrence argument. That traditional finance is worried that people will leave to this other form of competitor, so is preemptively unable or less likely to engage in the type of measures that they describe, or that are pretty problematic. But secondly, it's why on earth, even if they had more money, are they giving that back randomly as welfare to people and their citizens? There's a huge incentive problem that is unproven here. At the end of this debate, we care about individuals that have no other option. It's only our side that helps them get out of poverty.
I'd like to thank Senator Megan for that speech. Welcome to our affirmative. Yeah, Mia, can we turn it back on just a little bit warmer than it initially was?
Panel, obviously things get worse in the developing world, in countries where there is economic crisis and people already do not have faith in the banks that exist. When everyone in those countries takes their money out of those banks to put it into cryptocurrency, obviously to the extent that the problem in places like Argentina is a lack of faith in the existing bank infrastructure, you make that so incredibly worse for the long term specifically, when you tell people to take their money out to invest in something that is entirely pegged against nothing except for how many people feel like a coin is doing particularly well at any point in time, obviously those countries get worse. Those countries get worse when you cannot tax the billionaires who live in those countries because they have no incentive to store their money in regular banks. Obviously, like, their side is so much more astronomically worse for the developing world, and you should weigh that against the relatively like small impact of things like sending small amounts of money across the world. A few things in this speech. Firstly, like, who gets better access and all of this sort of stuff, and like what are their benefits. Secondly, what are our harms, and then lastly, like, how does this impact the developing world? Firstly, in terms of access to currency, and when they tell you things like you can't opt out of banks and you need to be able to send money to the Hong Kong protesters, I think the first thing to say is note how contradictory this is with their material about why it's impossible to regulate anyway, which is why we should give up trying to stop things like criminal activity. But the second thing to say here is just gut check the fact that the majority of people who are anonymous are so for particularly evil reasons, right? To the extent that some people feel really, really empowered to send money to protesters entirely out of goodwill, note that the Hong Kong government also has incentives to use the exact same systems to do much, much more worse things. Like, firstly, note that the incentive is much greater to be doing evil things if you are a regime or a government that uses crypto and is trying to, like, skirt all of that kind of stuff, which means that things actually get worse for those protesters. But also note that I just don't think it is true that most people have goodwill to send extra money around to those kinds of protest movements and stuff like that. Obviously, it is worse. But secondly, note that the harms that we give you are so much more astronomical here. I think they mitigate this by saying that, or they attempt to mitigate this by saying that these things can exist anyway. I think this is so incredibly untrue for the reasons that we give you, which is to say that crypto has physical infrastructure. Run a huge magnet through it, it's fucked, right? Like, there is absolutely no reason why you cannot, like, check for these huge amounts of servers that use huge amounts of computing powers, when obviously there is some kind of trace for that, right? The other thing to say is that there is a huge online trace to the extent that you can just regulate things on the internet by seeing where they exist and blocking all of the apps that you use to sell crypto. Obviously, it is possible to regulate this criminal activity. The other thing that they say is that people were doing illegal things before crypto. Obviously, on comparative, I think it got a lot worse because obviously it is easier to send money across the world than it is to get on a plane with your briefcase filled with $50,000 to go participate in some human trafficking. Obviously, be comparative, things get so much worse under their side of the house when they give people anonymity. But the last thing I want to say here is about this push that we get as to why banks now have to compete by making things more accessible. I want to flip this by saying that banks now have the incentive to compete by doing things like not having regulation, to the extent that if they think that everyone who wants to skirt regulation can just use crypto, they then have no incentive to be enforcing those kinds of things, which I think is so much worse when they're competing with something which inherently has no regulation. The way that they will probably trade that off by trying to make this more accessible is by similarly allowing people to be anonymous and all of that sort of stuff. Astronomical harms there, seems quite bad. Yeah, in terms of like whether this is good for unstable countries having access, like the first thing to say is how much you just absolutely tank the economies of these countries at the point at which you say that there is another option other than the like national bank, right? You need to develop trust. But they say that those banks are bad because they can like you can't get your money out at the point at which it crashes. That is obviously also true for crypto. It's also true that for countries that have like huge instability in their infrastructure. Like if all of if the app stops working, you also don't have access to your money and all of that sort of stuff. I think that's really uncomparative. At least if it is a national bank, the government has an incentive to try and like repay some of that. They have an incentive to build up that infrastructure again in the future and give people their money back, compared to it just disappearing into the abyss of the internet. The last thing that they say is that people have access to banking systems who otherwise wouldn't. That's like people who don't have citizenships and sending remittances back home and all of that. First thing to say is that there is like you do need some kind of access to get an account. Like you do need identification to get an account on a lot of these apps in a lot of instances. But the second thing to say, in terms of remittances, I think people also did this before cryptocurrency to a certain extent. Like I think their notion of sending around like briefcases of money is probably just a lot easier when you are sending small amounts of money back home to your family comparative to large amounts of money for things like human trafficking, which is why this like specifically isn't a contradiction, right? But the other thing to say is I think you just need some level of access to things, but also at the point at which they make economies in the developing countries worse, at the point at which they have less tax revenue, at the point at which their national banks are less stable. That gets worse for the majority of people. That looks like people who don't have access to the internet. That looks like people who are oppressed by regimes who are able to evade things like sanctions, like Russia, which leads to so much more harm to so much more people. Obviously, you should weigh that much more highly because remittances are secondary to not being persecuted by the regime that you live in. One of the reasons that we give you as to why crypto is bad. I already talked about the crime thing, and I already talked about tax. Actually, I'll talk about tax again, which is to say that stuff like offshore accounts are in fact traceable because, like, you can just literally look at the bank accounts. Like, you have to get that money into that offshore bank account to some extent. You have to literally sit this in a bank which has to be registered and all of this other sort of stuff. But, like, to the extent that you can observe things like people skirting tax through crypto, I think that also probably just concedes a lot of their benefits in terms of like people in the developing world evading things like checking if they are citizens and stuff like that. Tax obviously gets worse for the reason that you cannot look at these things. That means people having less tax in developing countries, harms of that are incredibly significant. In terms of the environment, like the environmental impacts, the response is like Ethereum's like fine, so it's okay and we can just do more regulation. I think this doesn't respond to the specific mechanism, which is that often you actually do need to like do some kind of increase in computing power for Bitcoin to the extent that Bitcoin is one of the biggest coins. In terms of Ethereum, I think that method of mining is probably just much less accessible to the developing world, so they mitigate a lot of their benefits there. But the last thing to say is that you need to prove an incentive to like transition to other types of energy in order to not be able to cop those environmental harms. I think the developing world probably has no incentive to go for like a more expensive form of energy consumption and all of that sort of stuff. Okay, in terms of the developing world and the harms that we give you, I think they just assert that things like Bitcoin are stable and Ethereum. This is like so incredibly untrue. We don't say this empirically. We are not empirically observing this. We give you mechanisms, which is to say that the worth of Bitcoin is entirely based on how many people feel interested in it. That is obviously incredibly nebulous. The US economy is like empirically based on like services. It is based on products and all of that sort of stuff. Which means it is much more likely to be more stable. That is also true for national banks and local economies, which means you're less likely to have economic crises in the first place. But the other outcome, so the harms that we give you in times of crisis are so much worse because people massively withdraw their money from bank accounts. This also looks like people doing, like, you can't invest and peg that against the assets, you can't invest in assets and peg that against your reserve bank at the point at which your reserve bank is incredibly volatile. I think the other mechanism for why it is likely to be really unstable is people do not understand crypto in the first place compared to the current dollar. So at the end of this speech, obviously they cannot regulate any of these things at the point at which crypto exists. Obviously economies in the developing world get worse at the point at which can't do tax.
I'd like to thank the affirmative for that speech. Welcome to that negative.
This team presupposes that they are more intelligent than the world's poor who access things like Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. Because we tell you there is a reason why people make the choice to use things like cryptocurrency, whether that be because they don't trust traditional banks, or because traditional banks have historically underserved them, or because those traditional banks are difficult to access. But our team tells you those people deserve the choice to not use a system which has never done them right, which has served incredible injustices towards them. We tell you that these people are the most vulnerable people in the debate. They deserve the power to engage in transactions, to get things like loans. If this gives them that power, we should not trade off. We can trade off virtually any harm that they bring us. 3 questions. Firstly, on access to finance. Secondly, on the negative externalities. And thirdly, on traditional banking. Firstly, on access to finance. Their first claim here is that, well, you can just invest in gold or US dollar instead if your local currency isn't stable enough. A couple of issues with this. The first is, clearly, as we explained to you at Eugene, these are not transaction networks. That means you can't send things like gold or USD over networks. But secondly, even in a country like Australia, I cannot send other people money in USD. I only have access to AUD. And the reason for that is these traditional banking networks just don't have access to the foreign exchange reserves to engage in transactions in other currencies besides their local ones. But the second issue with this is, even if you believe that people can still engage in transactions, the most clear delta here is on loans. Because even if you're able to access a network which permits you to send money to another person, that does not mean that you have access to a loan network through which you can achieve things like microfinance. Because it is just so essential for people who are illegal immigrants, who aren't trusted by banks, who are a certain ethnicity that in their country isn't trusted, who have questionable statuses on immigration, like I said previously. These people deserve access to the capacity to start businesses, to develop their communities, to build things and create things with money. The only way that these people have access to this kind of capital is through things like decentralized currencies, because banks simply do not trust someone if they are discriminated against or if they don't have access to identification, etc. Their second claim then as well, if you cannot get access to something like USD or a bank, you surely can't get access to cryptocurrencies. The first and obvious response to this that we give you at Eugene is that there are things like exchange brokers, and I'd also point out to you that these things are separate to banks. So the fact that you have access to an exchange broker does not mean that you have access to a bank. And there is substantially different capital required to set up an exchange broker than there is a bank, which should suggest, because you need all the money to invest, to have the necessary liquidity to actually operate that bank, which should suggest to you that these exchange brokers exist in far more circumstances than banks, which suggests there is a set of people who have access to cryptocurrency, but do not have access to these kinds of traditional banks. But the second response to this is sometimes a bank is just inaccessible or is just dysfunctional. They do things like lock you out of accessing your funds when crises happen. They do things like only permit you to use your local currency because they don't have the exchange reserves to allow you to operate in other currencies. And we think in these situations, people deserve the right to an alternative, the right to a choice, and that choice which we give them is decentralized currencies, is cryptocurrencies. So who do we help give access to finance? Firstly, it's people in oppressive states. And I would note that oppressive states are the states in which this is likely to get enforced, and the less oppressive states with less government control where crime occurs is where crime is still going to occur and still going to function. But people like journalists in Hong Kong, people who are organizing liberation fronts, those are the people who can no longer get access to financing. Secondly, we tell you, people who find it difficult to access traditional banking networks, people who cannot trust their traditional banks. How should you weigh this? I think the clearest principle imperative in this debate is that this team has no right to sacrifice these vulnerable people in the name of any other trader. These are people who have been failed by governments, people who have been failed by traditional banks, and this team would give governments the power to ban them from accessing the life raft which is helping them escape that sinking ship. But secondly, this is a significant group of people, but it's clearly not such a substantial group of people that it is going to take an entire country. Our proposition was never that the entire country of Argentina ceases to use Argentinian banks, just that there are a set of people who are particularly concerned about that currency, who particularly need that stability because of their financial position. Those people deserve access to it. Cutting off these people is like cutting off life rafts from a ship because they make the ship too heavy. We think that safety, that importance, that life raft that it gives people is fundamentally their right. Thirdly, because even if this team thinks there are alternatives, these people deserve choice. They are rational people who can make decisions for themselves. And if they believe that cryptocurrencies are the best thing for them, this team has no right to take that choice away from them. Sure, there might be alternatives, but if these people believe that those alternatives are worse, it is their prerogative to choose a cryptocurrency which they believe to be better. Next, let's look at the 8 negative externalities. Their first is to say that, well, this facilitates crime networks. The issue with this is, firstly, we point out that lots of crime is morally good. That looks like journalists, it looks like illegal immigrants trying to secure money from back home, that looks like liberation movements. But secondly, we obviously explain to you that organized crime can still occur. They say, well, this has a footprint. Making meth has a footprint. It doesn't stop criminal organizations from engaging in that practice. Clearly, these are organizations with hundreds of millions of dollars who are expert at evading police in the countries in which they exist. They operate in rural and remote areas. They operate in spaces and countries in which the government has very limited capacity to enforce activity against them, and are great at evading the police empirically, which suggests to you that on weighing, evil crime, the type of crime like pedophiles, the type of crime like organized networks, are the ones with sufficient capital, the hundreds of millions of dollars required to set up cryptocurrency networks on their own and then to evade governments. Comparatively, the set of people that we talk about has so much limited access to capital. People like illegal immigrants, people like underground networks of journalists. These are not individuals with that capacity to set up networks, but even if they did have that capacity, they don't have the same ability to evade governments in the same way that organized crime networks do, because they aren't experienced in that crime, or they live in states in which governments are far better at enforcing laws than the countries in which organized crime operates in, which suggests to you that if you care, even if you think there is more evil crime in the world than moral crime, it is the evil crime that still pervades under their side, but the morally good crime, the just instances that they stop from occurring. Second claim then that they make is that, well, this is bad for the environment. The first issue with this is we explained to you at Bella, there is a large adoption of proof of stake, which just immediately wipes out this entire harm. Because the thing that produces and causes lots of energy use in cryptocurrencies is when they use things like proof of work. That's where you use computers to mine Bitcoin by finding primes. It consumes large amounts of energy. Proof of stake requires you to hedge crypto or a stake in order to get that fund. We tell you that cryptocurrencies, like Ethereum, have already switched towards proof of stake, which uses significantly less amounts of energy. Firstly, because, and the reason why other currencies continue this is firstly, the evidence that Ethereum was able to do it successfully. Secondly, because there was pressure to avoid things like bans and regulations by reducing the impact on the environment. But thirdly, because proof of stake is in the interest of the people with the most cryptocurrency, because they are then able to get and mine more crypto because they have the largest stake in order to mine it further. But secondly, countries broadly are just adopting renewable energy. That is, yes, this is taking time. However, cryptocurrency is not going to take over tomorrow and the world's total currency is not going to become Bitcoin, which should suggest to you that, well, yes, maybe it will take time for this environmental movement to occur. But firstly, you shouldn't be that concerned about the environmental damage as things switch towards proof of stake. But secondly, even if you are, we think you should not sacrifice vulnerable people in the developing world who did not cause climate change in order to avoid its harms. That is unjust and that is unfair. Next, they tell you that, well, people use it to avoid tax, but there are just a myriad of other ways that people avoid tax. They use offshore tax havens. And I would note to you that avoiding tax by converting it to Bitcoin is as ineffective at avoiding tax as just not reporting the amount of money that you earn, because you effectively have to lie to your government about the amount of money that you have. It would be totally ineffective at avoiding tax, even if it were, but we clearly tell you there are other ways of avoiding tax that people use far more often. Finally, on the traditional banking system, their claim here is that countries adopt crypto, and that is bad because it is unstable. But this point should just be a relevant debate, because it is so speculative. Only a handful, maybe 1 or 2 countries, have ever even attempted to adopt this. It is so incredibly unlikely that future countries do. But secondly, even if they do, I say countries also have that choice. Countries have the capacity to the same set of knowledge that the University of Queensland provides to these guys, and if they believe, and if this team is able to figure out that it's a bad idea, we suggest that countries have the prerogative to do the same. We tell you that these countries, if they do adopt it, probably do so for good reasons, probably do so intelligently, and we flip it into a benefit by saying that it makes banks behave better. Clearly, a very clear negative win.
I'd like to thank the negative for that speech. Oh, sorry. Welcome, Neg Reply. Yeah.
I'm going to ask 2 questions in this reply. Who do we help and who do we harm? Who do we help? This affirmative team has simultaneously the most pessimistic and optimistic outlook in this debate. Where are they optimistic? This is where they explain the individuals I described to you at first as being 1, incredibly financially vulnerable and oppressed, and 2, massively significant in volume, can simply access other forms of capital. And we explain to you that is just simply not the case. Because they say you can exchange your currency, and you can get money from your friends and family, or you can get global assistance. We tell you at Eugene, we tell you at Charlie, that's pretty tricky when your 1,000 baht is worth $1 US, or when all of your friends and family are as destitute as you, or when accessing global assistance just has an immensely high barrier to entry. When you're that protester on the streets of Hong Kong and the CCP is monitoring everything you do and every exchange you make and every dollar you send, cryptocurrency is just a lifeline. When you can access some anonymous funds, when you can increase the value and empirical truth of your protesting, that benefit is just massive. Then they are simultaneously incredibly pessimistic because they are just so deeply uncharitable. Because their one response to our plethora of material on giving funds to literally the entirety of the financially unstable developing rural world is that there's no way to get this money online when you operate in cash, etc. Like exchange brokers exist. Crypto wallets like Binance have massive incentives to increase accessibility to the developing world, as we tell you at Eugene and as we tell you at Charlie. Finally, when they claim that financial institutions in places like Argentina lose capital and that's bad, what's the harm of this? Clearly, citizens should have the agency to withdraw their cash from an Argentinian bank. They deserve the option to be able to step back and have a choice against the government and a choice against financial institutions that have abandoned them, that have decimated their savings, and that have destroyed their currencies. Our claim was never that the whole of the Bank of Argentina would operate in Bitcoin. Our claim was that we give these people the option to be able to do that. This team is just so deeply uncharitable with this. Who do we harm? Because I feel like this Australs, I continue to trade off some pretty vulnerable people, and I'm going to do it again. Because in a debate about cryptocurrency, it's bizarre to me that all of this affirmative team's harms are on the victims of human trafficking. Panel, just weigh this, because the momentous volume of people we tell you that we financially liberate are just more important than the increase in human trafficking victims. Because maybe this team gets their cake and some human trafficking victims increase on our side. But there is just literally zero empirical truth, one, behind that claim actually having happened, but two, there are just so many other ways to be able to, like, for human trafficking victims to be paid for. Clearly, this is not exclusive to cryptocurrency. Their better push is on the environment, but unfortunately for them, they are living in 2020 and we are living in 2023, where there have been immense efforts to mitigate the impact on the environment of cryptocurrency, where there have been efforts to do things like have proof of stake, which we tell you to literally no responses, and this team just refuses to engage with that. We explained to you down the bench that even if the environment is a little bit worse off, and even if there are some more victims of human trafficking, that is a bullet that we're willing to bite. Because at least we are able to alleviate the suffering of people who are reliant on an exchange and a currency that literally has decimated in value over the last decades, on a financial institution that they have no faith in because the government has continued to run it into the ground. We give people a beacon of hope. We give them a light to be able to have some form of savings. And even if that saving is unstable, it is just so much more stable than everything that this team points to down the bench. They themselves concede at first speaker that these currencies are incredibly unstable. We tell you, obviously crypto is a better option. Who cares about the environment? Who cares if there are a few more victims of human trafficking? When we alleviate people out of poverty, when we give them a choice, when we give them an option, that is why we must win this debate.
Folks, thank you for reply. Welcome to affirmative reply. Look at that. Here.
The real thing that harms illegal immigrants or vulnerable people in this round is economic collapse. And when you entrench economic collapse and you make it impossible for countries and governments to recover from economic collapse because no one is putting their money in financial institutions, instead all of their money is spent on speculative cryptocurrencies. Two issues then in this reply. Firstly on the economy and secondly on people. Let's talk about the economy first and why you should believe this is the most important thing in the round. Firstly, it affects everyone. So insofar as they talk about various different stakeholders, the economy affects all of those people, plus more of those people on top, which means that it is a larger scale of benefit. Secondly, these are the most vulnerable people that are affected most by the economy, because the people that lose their jobs in economic crisis are the worst off when businesses cannot afford to pay them, so you should weigh those people as incredibly valuable. Thirdly, as we explained, this leads to long-term problems, long-term structural problems in your economy, which means you cannot recover, which means people remain under the poverty line. And lastly, in response to the principal push we get from their side about people should be able to have access to take money out of the institutions, just reality check this claim. Because governments impose regulations on what people do with their money all the time in the name of the benefit of the economy. And if they did not, then you would not have an economy in the first place, because at the very instant that a risk happens or that people perceive that there is something wrong with the economy, everybody pulls their money out of everything and the entire economy collapses. That is the type of harm that is prevented by the affirmative team. The first claim here is then, is this a good hedge against inflation? We point to several other ways that you can hedge against inflation, for example, through your reserve currency, for example, through gold. And secondly, we give structural reasons why these coins are more speculative. And the only response we get is, well, you can use the USDC, but if you were using the USDC, which is pegged to the US dollar, you may as well just use the US dollar, right? Because they're equivalent in terms of their pegging. But the more important material that is given here is in terms of economic crisis. Firstly, we give you reasons why governments are likely to do this incredibly poorly, to no response by this negative team, which is they rush into political incentives and they do not like constraining monetary policy through raising interest rates. Secondly, this creates a risk in the economy because of the perception of your economy being in collapse, the perception of people that your economy is very speculative. Thirdly, it leads to less money in the banks because by this team's very mechanism, people want to pull their money out the banks. And that harms people far, far more because when banks do not have the ability to lend money, you cannot fund development projects. You cannot, for example, fund people to continue on their mortgage, which means the economic crisis is far, far exacerbated under their side. It means that those crises therefore circulate. What I want you to do here is envisage the best case scenario for this negative team. Everyone in developing nations that have potentially unstable economies pulls their money out of banks, puts it into Bitcoin, and never puts it back into banks. How do they envisage those countries recovering from their economic crisis? They have no mechanism. So let's then talk about people. Where in our very, very worst case, we told you we have one, prevent a bigger scale of harms in terms of the types of harms that are happening, and secondly, prevent the most egregious forms of harm, which principally is something that you should strive for. What do they say? Firstly, they talk about protesters. Firstly, mitigate that benefit because we explain there are ways to circumvent this if you are so benevolent that people agree with your cause. But secondly, as we explained from first affirmative, this cryptocurrency is a way that sanctioned countries use to get around sanctions. So insofar as they talk about authoritarian nations, those nations are benefited under their side when they can use cryptocurrency to skirt sanctions, to have access to more things like weapons, to oppress their nation more. Then in terms of crime, they say, well, organized crime will still exist, but never engage with the mechanisms we give you as to why this ban is likely to be effective. So you should believe from the start of the debate that this ban is likely to be effective. Organized crime, at very least, will be mitigated to a huge extent. And we talk. Then the next thing they say is that, well, most crime is morally good. No, most crime is morally bad. The types of things that we ban are more likely to be morally evil. We gave you examples of the types of things we talk about. And the organised crime institutions being good at evading police is the very, very reason we need this. Because this is the one way you can track them. When their money is in a bank account and you can subpoena it. When you can look at their transactions and find out who is involved. That is incredibly important. So proud to propose.
I'd like to thank you for your reply to that speech and indeed everyone for the debate. Shake your hands later on.
Good job. Good job, you guys killed it.
Yeah. Probably. You guys want
Do you want to save it? Save the live?
Yeah.